Welcome to all those who've just joined us. I am Maria Patsalos and I will be your host today. We are really pleased to be running this event jointly with PGIM Real Estate and the Gay Women's Network. Hopefully you've all had a chance to view the fantastic film Changing the Game, which is an award-winning LGBTQ plus documentary depicting the lives of trans teenage athletes. Today we are looking at transgender participation in competitive sport, bringing in some key themes from the film and discussing some broader issues around trans athlete participation. I am really pleased to introduce our panelists. We have Jamie Hooper, a board member and Diversity and Inclusion Committee Chair of the Federation of Gay Games and the founding director of Inclusive Cultures. We next have Verity Smith, a trans rugby player and trans inclusion in sports youth worker for Mermaids UK. And last but no means least, we have Natalie Washington, a trans football player and campaign lead for Football versus Transphobia. So what are your reactions to the documentary? I know you've all seen it. What did you think of its depiction of teenage trans athletes?
I think for me, the film represented a really good mix of the challenges that athletes face because of the different rules and the different states that they were competing in. It represents a really interesting dynamic of kind of where sport is at with this discussion at the moment.
The choice of kind of, I suppose, cases that they talked about was really interesting and it made a lot of sense. What was really nice was the way they approached it in terms of showing that actually first and foremost they're human beings. They're quite young people trying to make their way in the world. They're playing a sport that they love playing. They get a lot out of that from a personal perspective, and that's fundamentally why trans athletes are in sport to begin with, as are any athletes. It's because we love doing it, we get something out of it, we enjoy it, and didn't frame it initially in that context of controversy, which so much conversation about trans people does.
In my perspective as well, working with young trans and gender diverse young people, having that film out there is amazing for the fact that these young people are asking for role models. They want to be seen out there. And what this film showed was how it is possible with the right support and the right encouragement and the right people behind you that you can get involved in something like, as Natalie said, a sport that you love. Again, it's brilliant to see that these families were behind them, the colleges, the coaches were behind them, because without them, they're not going to be able to get that right information. They're not going to have the confidence to move forward. Being able to play sport as your authentic self is the best feeling in the world, and just knowing that you're accepted and that you're doing the sport that you love as you. And I think that the film brought it over very well for all three of the young people that was involved.
And what about this, the idea of the teenage trans athlete and the timing around transitioning and body development, etc.? Can you share some insights in relation to that as well?
One of the things we're sort of seeing is once you get to 18 and you're going through the transitional aspects of your own journey, that sports are not there to protect or support you either, because a lot of these young people then are going to have to take a year out to then get their hormone levels correct, to then prove that they're able to compete. We've not got a continuance for them, and we're not offering them anything else that they can do to get involved during that time. And there's no we're not seeing any support in regards to science and these young people in sport. And a lot of it is assumptions, and a lot of it is people being put into the same category when we need to look at things on a case-by-case basis, because again, everybody is individual with how they're getting involved in their sport. Each sport as well has their own rules and regulations around this, so nothing is the same when we're talking around this.
We saw in the film how much opposition the trans athletes would get, often from opposing athletes' parents, and how vile that abuse really was. What advice would you give to young trans athletes who are encountering this kind of opposition and abuse from people who are much older than them, let alone their own kind of peers?
From my perspective, it'd be talk to your coaches, speak to parents, your carers, whoever you've got around you, keep in contact with whoever it is that you've got your connections with in your school. If it's your sport, it's your love, then you've got your right to be there as well. And again, as you mentioned, it is a lot around adults having the issues. And I think a lot of young people don't know how to speak up or be able to get that support as well. So again, it's about coaches being those voices for the young people as well, and other adults being the support rather than putting it all on that young person. Keep speaking, keep doing your sport, enjoy what you love, and just keep doing what you're doing for you and not for anybody else.
The film also tackles how trans athlete participation is regulated and the differences between regional and state and country level as well. What kind of advice would you give to trans athletes as they progress through the different stages in their career?
It helps if you're able to be open about it. For example, when I approached a football club to go and play women's football for the first time, I approached a coach and said, look, I'm a trans woman. Is it going to be cool if I come and play? I know I've checked the rules, but are generally people there going to be cool with that? But I think by being open with everyone, that helped me to feel that actually I'm accepted in this space. I don't want to say that that's advice, because one of the things we always say to trans people is actually you don't have to tell everyone. Like, it's not, you don't have a duty to tell people. You're not some kind of like problem that people need to know about. So that's why I'm clear that's not advice. Getting permission to play for me was long and was challenging, and having a group of people around me that knew what I was going through was helpful. And to Verity's point about building your kind of network, your support network is key. And I think that's good advice to young people anyway.
Verity, do you mind telling us a little bit about your experience?
I was already involved in women's rugby, so I played professional women's rugby for 26 years. But as I started my journey to transition, I was outed and it hit the news and the press. So my option was to turn it into a positive and then fight to stay playing. I was lucky enough to be able to carry on playing women's rugby up to a point, unfortunately, where I was injured. But during that journey, I had people who would hand my photograph out in rugby clubs and say, do you know that this is a trans person? And quite a lot, my photograph gets put out in the wrong context because they've got another agenda, again, with sport. And this affects young people, because if they're seeing things in the news and they're seeing things on social media, that's a real barrier for people wanting to get involved in sport, because they're scared to what's going to happen to them. And for a lot of young people, it's not safe for them to out themselves to get involved in sport. So again, we need sports governing bodies to start looking at policies, rules and regulations, databases for keeping these young people safe, but while still enabling them to get involved in sport. Because a lot of the people I speak to say, well, I'm not allowed, or why can't I? And instead of that, it's how can we get you involved?
And both you, Verity, and Natalie, you're both involved in team sports. And Verity, you just mentioned that it was important for you. You had your team supporting you. Natalie, rather, did you also have the support of your team? And how important is that?
I think if I'd felt that my team didn't want me to be there, I would have drifted away. I would have stopped playing. I had a journey of 18 months between joining my football team and actually being allowed to play a competitive game, because I had to get permission through the FA. That support from my teammates was critical, because it helped me get through that phase for 18 months where I couldn't play. We're not talking about a dedicated LGBTQ club here or anything. Not an area where there's a lot of a really visible queer community, and yet it was a football club that's trying to grow the game, trying to get people involved in the sport, and being supportive of the people that are at your club, whoever they are, and for whatever they're bringing to the table is a core part of that for any sport and any type of club, whether it be trans people or not.
How does the Federation of Gay Games handle the issue of trans participation? And what discussions are you having with future host cities? And just talk about the challenges around that.
We're starting to get to that point now where we are having to tackle trans inclusion at kind of the forefront of what we're doing. We're having those bigger kind of global organizations come to us to ask about how we do things. And it's not like we've got it nailed, but what we're trying to work on at the moment is the most inclusive policy as possible around not having to submit any evidence, not having to submit kind of scientific data, and that this is built on trust as part of that community. And I guess with that is also the caveat of trying to make sure that people don't abuse that system. So a lot of it is about good faith and respect and trust. The other side of it, as a global organization, we have to work with is the fact that people are coming from all kinds of different nations around the world that are at various different inclusive stages around particularly the trans inclusion discussion.
I mean, you lead me really swiftly and beautifully onto my next question, which is about how progressive the UK is on the world stage.
What we see in the UK particularly is that a lot of the governing bodies here are pushing back against what's coming down from world level organizations to say, actually, we want to be more inclusive than this. But one of the really good things, particularly about football, that I think is great that not a lot of people know, is that they say that mixed football is totally fine up to the age of 18. So it just takes all of this discussion out of the way. It just doesn't matter. There's a recognition that PE teachers and coaches and officials make these decisions every day about, should this person be in that position or playing with this team? How can we make this game a bit fairer? Should this person be playing with a better team because they're more successful or more skilled? Or these are decisions that people have been making every day for a long time, that we think is this massively complicated, dangerous process, when it's not. People do it all the time.
Moving on to the kind of wider society picture of trans people, which has obviously come under the spotlight in the last 12 months. We've had, J.K. Rowling putting her views across, and I think the question for the panel is, how do we bring all these kind of opposing views and values together? And is it even possible? And what's the best way to educate people who have kind of these kind of slightly opposing views?
The first step to understanding is listening, isn't it? And I think what we have at the moment is not a lot of listening, but a lot of shouting. And I think what would be great to see is just more visibility of kind of everyday trans people. So I think as we start to see trans people getting published more in literature, trans people getting published more in news media and whatever, an understanding will start to emerge, and that actually this kind of boogeyman that's over here will start to be kind of taken apart. I think a more mature conversation about what actually trans people want when it comes to rights and participation in society is important as well, because actually how many perspectives have you read from trans people about it would be really interesting. It's cisgender people, which is not trans people, talking about trans people. And I think once we see that, I think we'll start to see the picture improving a little bit. Yeah.
I think as well, it's got to be with us, not without us. And we're seeing a lot of these conversations and talks are had without anyone from the gender diverse community even involved. And a lot of assumptions are being made based on using cis athletes within sport and using research that isn't actually ethically approved or peer reviewed. We've got to remember that a lot of the times these conversations are around kids. That's what they are. They are kids. They are teenagers. You saw them with their friends doing everyday things. So I think it's about remembering that as well when adults are putting this information out there and all these talks are happening.
We've got a question from Zoe. Zoe's a post-surgery trans woman, and she says that she's lost a lot of strength and muscle since going through her hormone therapy, and she's wondering if someone like her would still have a sporting advantage over a cisgender woman, and if so, to what extent?
It comes back to the point at the start. We said that everybody's individual, right? There's going to be different advantages for all different stuff. You still see 5'6" people playing elite basketball. There's not many, but there are some out there. It all depends. Another really good example is Rachel McKinnon in America, who's smashed the world cycling masters kind of scene by storm. But actually, she is quite tall, is fairly broad, which is a real disadvantage for cycling, and is having to work even harder in that sphere to train at that level and compete.
It's just an interesting thing about how advantage is seen, because people are tall, people are broad. I'm about 6 foot, and people say that's an advantage in football, but probably the finest football team of recent years, Pep Guardiola's Barcelona team, they're all really small because they've got a low centre of gravity. I've had the same experiences. I've noticed that I'm significantly less strong, I'm significantly slower, and that happened within the first year or two. And most sports have a rule of about a year or two, and then you can participate if you're a trans woman transitioning, and then playing in women's sport. I think we need more research to understand how that actually plays out.
If everyone can just give our closing thoughts on where do we see this going forward, and what do we want to happen in the next 5 years, let's say.
The progression we've seen in the last 10 years or so around different gender identities, in terms of how non-binary people are now protected under the Equality Act in some way. I think it's all on the table. Everyone is having these discussions. It is a global discussion point. Let's see.
There has to be a way of allowing everybody to participate, and I think we have to look at ways in which sport can evolve to be more inclusive of all types of different people. And I think at grassroots, having mixed sport more is a good thing. Let's just get people playing, get people involved in sport, enjoying sport, and being active?
Sports for everybody, and let's find how everybody can get involved rather than saying how you can't get involved.
Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you to our panelists, especially for sharing their stories on this, what we all agree is a complex issue, but fundamentally it's all about inclusivity and the beauty of sport. So thank you all and have a good evening. Bye.